Prison food exposed. ADX Florence vs Pelican Bay Supermax meals. The metal tray slid across the counter with a harsh scrape. On it sat a pale slab of meatloaf, mashed potatoes that looked more like glue, and a small carton of milk. An inmate at ADX Florence stared at the food with disgust. He had been locked in a concrete cell for 23 hours a day, and this was supposed to keep him alive. But when he bit into it, he gagged. The meat was so dry it crumbled into sand in his mouth. The potatoes were cold, with lumps of powder that hadn't been mixed right. He pushed the tray away in anger, shouting to the guard, "You call this food?" The guard didn't even blink. To the staff, this wasn't about taste. It was about survival. Inmates here weren't fed to be happy. They were fed to last just another day. Meanwhile, nearly 1,500 miles away at Pelican Bay Supermax in California, another inmate sat with his tray. His meal was nearly identical, bland, pale, and portioned to the ounce. Only this time the food was worse. His beans had a sour smell like they had been sitting too long. He pressed his fork into the cornbread and it broke apart like chalk. Around him, the other prisoners muttered curses under their breath. Everyone knew meals like this weren't accidents. They were designed. Small calories, low cost, zero comfort. In these prisons, food was power. For men locked in cages, meals weren't just nutrition. They were a lifeline. And when that lifeline was weak, prisoners snapped. Some refused to eat, saving food to trade later. Others risked punishment to start fights over extra bread. At ADX Florence, where the most dangerous inmates in America are held, one prisoner threw his entire tray at a guard's face, screaming that the food was poison. The cafeteria erupted in chaos. But the punishment came swiftly. He was dragged away, shackled, and his meals for the next week were replaced with something called the loaf. This loaf wasn't really food. It was punishment in edible form. A baked brick made of flour, beans, and vegetables, mashed together so it had every nutrient the body needed but none of the taste. Hard, heavy, and almost impossible to chew, it was served 3 times a day to rebellious inmates. Guards called it nutritional discipline. Inmates called it torture. And just when prisoners thought it couldn't get worse, Pelican Bay revealed a darker truth. One inmate claimed he found maggots crawling inside his rice. Another said his soup tasted like bleach. Was it contamination? Or something more deliberate? Whispers spread through the cell blocks. Were the meals being sabotaged to break their spirits? The shocking thing is, official documents show that both ADX Florence and Pelican Bay have strict budgets for food, often spending less than $3 per inmate per day. Compare that to what a school cafeteria spends, and you realize prisoners aren't just being punished with isolation. They're being punished at every single bite. But here's where it gets chilling. In one case, an ADX inmate tried to survive by hoarding bread and trading it like gold. The guards caught on and his stash was discovered. When they opened his cell, the smell hit first. Rotting bread, crawling with mold, hidden under his bed. His punishment? Weeks on the loaf. And his body started to change, losing weight, skin pale, eyes sunken. Other inmates watched from behind steel doors, knowing the same fate could be theirs. The clash between ADX Florence and Pelican Bay wasn't just about concrete walls and razor wire. It was about food, the most basic human need, turned into a weapon. But the question is, when food becomes punishment, how far will inmates go to fight back? That's when the first shocking incident happened. One that would change the way both prisons handled meals forever. The trays clattered that morning at ADX Florence, but something was different. Whispers ran through the units. The food had changed. Instead of the same bland servings, the portions were smaller, almost half of what they'd been before. The scrambled eggs were dry crumbles, the toast barely toasted, and the milk watered down. Prisoners knew what this meant. Retaliation. The fight over the food the night before had triggered a crackdown. One inmate, Miguel, a man serving a life sentence without parole, picked up his tray and stared at it. He had eaten bad food before, his whole life had been about survival, but this was different. This wasn't just cheap food. It was starvation. He called out, his voice echoing in the block, "They're trying to break us." The guards ignored him, but the prisoners heard every word. In the cells, men began to rebel in quiet ways. Some flushed their meals down the toilet, leaving the smell of sour food clogging the pipes. Others scribbled messages in ketchup packets on their walls. It wasn't about hunger anymore, it was about dignity. But things turned dark fast. One inmate refused to eat for 3 days straight. His cellmate tried to beg guards for help, but the staff didn't flinch. On the 4th day, the man collapsed. By the time medical arrived, he was unconscious, skeletal, his lips cracked. They carried him out on a stretcher, and the silence that followed in the block was heavier than the steel doors. At Pelican Bay, inmates faced their own nightmare. The chow hall, already notorious for its filth, served rice with a strange odor one night. Men chewed reluctantly, exchanging nervous looks. Hours later, dozens fell sick, clutching their stomachs, vomiting into sinks and toilets. Some claimed the rice was spoiled. Others swore it had been poisoned. Rumors spread like fire. Was it an accident, or intentional? Prison officials dismissed the complaints, blaming sensitive stomachs. But the inmates weren't fooled. The idea that food, the only thing that connected them to life outside, could be tampered with ignited rage. One inmate, known as Big Dre, shouted across the tier, "If they're feeding us poison, then we're already dead men walking." The block roared in agreement. And then the riots began. The Pelican Bay Chow Hall erupted first. Inmates began banging their trays on the tables, the metal ringing like war drums. Guards rushed in, shields raised, barking orders. But the noise drowned them out. An inmate hurled his tray across the hall, and it smacked against a guard's helmet with a loud clang. That was the signal. Suddenly bodies surged forward. Fists, trays, spoons, anything could be turned into a weapon. Guards fired pepper spray, the air filling with a choking burn that made eyes water and lungs seize. But the men kept coming. Meanwhile, at ADX Florence, chaos spread in another way. The food deliveries, the carts wheeled down the halls, were sabotaged. Prisoners slammed their doors as guards passed, reaching through the slots to snatch bread and packets of jelly. In one unit, an inmate smeared mashed potatoes across his walls in protest, painting his anger in cold white streaks. Another filled his toilet with beans and flushed until it overflowed, flooding his cell. The less extreme lull came when officials tried to restore control. Meals were changed again, but this time they brought in something new: prepackaged, sealed meals. Plastic trays with shrink-wrapped food that looked sterile, like airplane meals. To the prison it was safer. Less chance of tampering, less chance of rebellion. But to the inmates, it was insulting. These meals stripped away even the illusion of hot food. They were cold, tasteless, and worse, they came with expiration dates printed on the packaging, a constant reminder that their time inside was rotting away too. One inmate at ADX cracked. He hurled his entire tray at the reinforced glass of his door, shattering the seal. The smell of rotten milk splattered across the floor, and he screamed so loud it echoed through the block. Guards swarmed him with tasers and cuffs, dragging him away as the other inmates cheered from behind bars. Food had become a war. And the prisons were losing control. The administrators at Pelican Bay decided to act. They instituted nutritional control, reducing portions further, cutting back on meat and serving more starch. Officials claimed it saved money, but everyone inside knew the truth. It was punishment disguised as policy. One day, a man named Reggie opened his tray and found nothing but 2 slices of bread, a small scoop of beans, and a bruised apple. He stared at it for a long time. "This isn't food," he muttered. "This is a joke." Across the tier, others lifted their trays to show the same pitiful portions. That's when things turned extreme again. A group of inmates refused their meals in unison. They stacked the trays in the middle of the hall, forming a pyramid of rebellion. The guards saw it as defiance. They stormed in, spraying pepper spray and dragging men to the SHU, the security housing unit, known as the Hole. Back at ADX Florence, things were no better. Officials experimented with the infamous loaf. Day after day, inmates received the same dense brick, impossible to swallow, even harder to digest. Men broke it apart with their hands, tossing chunks out of the slot. Some tried to trade it for toothpaste or soap. Others simply refused to eat. But then came the breaking point. An inmate, furious at yet another serving of the loaf, smashed it against his wall so hard it left a mark. He smeared it across the concrete, writing one word: starving. Guards stormed in minutes later, tackling him to the floor. His punishment? Not just more loaf. Now he would lose all commissary privileges too. No snacks, no extras. Nothing. Food wasn't just punishment anymore. It was control. And the men inside were running out of ways to resist. ADX Florence guards began monitoring every bite. They installed cameras in the chow delivery areas, tracking who ate, who threw food away, and who traded it. To outsiders this sounded like order. But to the men inside it felt like being fed under a microscope. Less extreme moments came when some inmates tried to adapt. They saved packets of jelly and peanut butter, hoarding them for weeks until they could build a small stash. Others crushed crackers into powder and mixed it with water to create a paste that tasted better than the loaf. Small rebellions, tiny ways to survive. But survival doesn't last forever. One afternoon, the cameras caught an inmate hiding bread under his mattress. Guards dragged him out and stripped his cell bare, even tearing apart his mattress. They found moldy bread, roaches crawling in the seams. The sight disgusted even the guards. And that's when the block exploded again. Inmates began flooding their cells, dumping trays into toilets, creating a stench that swept through the halls. Guards had to wear masks just to patrol. The punishment? Collective. Everyone in the unit lost hot meals for a week. The protests at Pelican Bay mirrored the chaos. Inmates in the SHU began pounding on their doors in rhythm, a haunting drumbeat that echoed through the isolation wing. They weren't asking for freedom. They were demanding food fit for humans. The warden's solution? Something no one expected. The new rule at Pelican Bay hit like a hammer. Meals would now be served only twice a day. Breakfast was gone. Prisoners would have to stretch lunch and dinner to survive the long nights. The anger was instant. Some shouted, others cursed, but everyone knew what this meant. Deeper hunger, weaker bodies, and shorter tempers. A less extreme moment came when inmates tried to cope. They drank water to fill their stomachs. They traded commissary snacks at sky-high prices. One ramen noodle pack suddenly worth 10 times more than before. It created a black market, a dangerous economy that put weaker inmates at risk. But then the extreme came back harder. One night, a fight broke out in the yard over a pack of cookies. It started with words, then fists, then blood. By the time guards rushed in, one inmate lay unconscious, his face smashed. All for something as small as sugar. At ADX Florence, the cycle of rebellion and punishment continued. Inmates in one block staged a hunger strike, refusing to touch their trays. Days passed, their bodies weakening. Officials dismissed it at first, saying the men would break. But on the 7th day, one collapsed. Medical staff rushed him out, and the rest cheered, not because they wanted him hurt but because his suffering proved their point. And then came the chilling retaliation. The retaliation was silent but brutal. At ADX Florence, prisoners were suddenly given meals with no variety at all. 4 days straight, every tray had the same thing: beans, bread, and water. No fruit, no milk, no meat. Just the bare minimum to keep them alive. At first, the men joked about it, mocking the monotony. But after a week, the laughter died. Their stomachs twisted, their bodies weakened, and the rage grew. "They're starving us slow," one inmate whispered. At Pelican Bay, things reached a boiling point too. A group of inmates discovered worms in their oatmeal. They threw their trays at the guards in fury, the chow hall turning into a storm of food, curses, and fists. Guards responded with batons and shields, beating men to the ground. Blood mixed with spilled milk on the floor, a grotesque reminder of how far things had fallen. The less extreme moments came afterward, when the blocks were silent, broken men sitting alone in their cells, staring at untouched trays. Hunger gnawed at them, but pride kept them from eating. And then the final extreme of this cycle struck. At Pelican Bay, a prisoner tried to escape during a food delivery, timing his move when the slot opened for a tray. He jammed the slot with cardboard, yanked it open wider, and tried to pull himself through. Guards reacted instantly, slamming him back and shattering his arm in the process. His screams echoed through the tier, a reminder that even food could be a trap. The war over prison meals wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about control, power, and punishment. And the question remained, how much more could these men take before something irreversible happened? His screams from the failed escape at Pelican Bay still echoed in the block. The man's arm had snapped when the slot was slammed shut, and everyone who saw it knew exactly what it meant. Desperation had reached a breaking point. But in prison, moments like this don't fade, they ferment. The less extreme calm that followed was deceptive. Guards tightened routines, trays were delivered under stricter rules, and inmates retreated into silence. At ADX Florence, meals were slid into cells with even less interaction. Some prisoners tried to pretend it was normal, biting into the tasteless bread as though forcing themselves to believe life would go on. Others chewed slowly, calculating every calorie, saving crusts for later. But silence in prison is never peace. It's the calm before a storm. The storm hit when word spread that one inmate at ADX had collapsed during exercise, his body weak from weeks of poor meals. When he was dragged out by medics, the tier erupted. Men pounded their steel doors, chanting one word over and over: food. 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 The sound grew like thunder, rattling through the Supermax. Guards rushed in, but they couldn't silence it. And just like that, the war over meals had reached a boiling point again. The hunger chants didn't die quickly. At ADX Florence, they carried on for days, turning into a coordinated hunger strike. Dozens of inmates refused trays, stacking them untouched near the slots. Guards tried intimidation, threats of losing yard time, of being transferred to harsher units, but the strike held. The less extreme moments were quiet acts of survival. Some inmates smuggled salt packets and sugar cubes from commissary, surviving on nothing but water sweetened with tiny grains. Others tore off pieces of bread and stashed them inside legal paperwork or between books, determined to make every crumb last. But every hunger strike has a price. One inmate, frail and hollow-eyed, collapsed in his cell after 10 days. Guards carried him out, but the sight of his limp body sparked fury across the block. Suddenly, trays weren't just refused, they were hurled back at the slot, food splattering across concrete. At Pelican Bay, the rebellion spread differently. Inmates began communicating through the pipes and walls, tapping codes to organize. The message was simple: when the next batch of trays arrived, nobody would touch them. Guards delivered breakfast the next morning to silence. Rows of untouched food sat on steel shelves. For the first time, Pelican Bay felt like a ghost town. But then came the extreme retaliation. Guards stormed the units, stripped men from their cells, and dragged them to isolation. The strike was over, but the punishment was only beginning. Pelican Bay's punishment was harsh. Inmates returned to their cells to find them stripped bare. No books, no radios, no commissary. Just 4 walls, a mattress, and the tray of punishment loaf. The loaf became their reality morning and night for weeks. The less extreme lull came as men tried to cope. Some soaked the loaf in water to soften it, choking down bites with grim determination. Others broke it apart, feeding bits to birds that swooped near the windows. Even in misery, they found small acts of defiance. But the extremes returned when one inmate snapped. He smeared the loaf across his body, screaming at the top of his lungs, "I'm not an animal." Guards rushed in, tackling him to the floor. The sight spread like wildfire, proof that the loaf wasn't just food, it was psychological warfare. At ADX Florence, the retaliation was subtler but just as cruel. Meals were cut to bare minimums and commissary prices doubled overnight. A pack of ramen now cost more than some inmates could afford in a month. The black market grew, gangs controlled the trade, and violence followed. One inmate was beaten in his cell for a single packet of peanut butter. His blood smeared across the wall told everyone else. Hunger was now a weapon between prisoners too. The war over meals had left guards in control, but it also pushed the prison population into dangerous desperation. ADX Florence became a machine of routine misery. The same trays, the same portions, the same hollow silence after every delivery. Guards walked past cells without looking in, dropping food like zookeepers feeding wild animals. The less extreme rhythm lulled administrators into thinking things had calmed. Inmates ate what they were given, no riots, no protests. But beneath that calm, anger brewed. The breaking point came when one inmate discovered a dead cockroach baked into his cornbread. He shouted until his voice cracked, holding it up for others to see. The block exploded in rage. Trays slammed against walls, food smeared across windows. Guards rushed in with shields and gas, turning the block into a choking haze. At Pelican Bay, the tension took another turn. Inmates refused the loaf and began carving messages into their walls: starving, animals, justice. Guards painted over them, but the words came back every morning, carved deeper. And then the next extreme shook everything. One inmate at Pelican Bay set his mattress on fire, using contraband matches and scraps of paper. Flames lit up the cell, smoke pouring into the block. Guards dragged him out coughing, but the message was clear. Hunger was pushing men toward destruction. The fire rattled Pelican Bay's staff. Officials declared an emergency lockdown. For weeks, no yard time, no visits, no commissary. Meals were pushed through slots with military precision. The less extreme moments during lockdown were suffocating. Men counted cracks in the walls, tapped messages through pipes, and tried to block out the constant gnaw of hunger. But the extremes always returned. At ADX Florence, an inmate attempted suicide with a sharpened piece of metal, leaving behind a note that read only, "I can't eat this anymore." He survived, but the message haunted both staff and prisoners. At Pelican Bay, things spiraled in another direction. Inmates smuggled commissary food into the black market again, trading for protection and favors. The economy of hunger became its own shadow government inside the prison. One man rose as its leader, controlling who ate and who starved. When another inmate challenged him, the result was a stabbing in the chow line, blood spraying across trays of beans and bread. Food wasn't just survival anymore. It had become currency, control, and chaos. The stabbing forced officials to react. At Pelican Bay, metal detectors were installed in the chow hall, guards doubled their presence, and food deliveries became more restricted. But the restrictions only inflamed tensions. The less extreme lull came when administrators introduced new balanced trays, with slightly larger portions and occasional fruit. For a few weeks, inmates believed things were improving. Some even ate in silence without protest. But then the extremes returned with vengeance. One morning, prisoners at ADX Florence discovered mold covering their bread. Dozens of inmates refused to eat, holding the green-stained slices up to cameras demanding answers. Guards ignored them, but the images spread through inmate letters and whispers, feeding the legend that the system was deliberately poisoning them. The breaking point hit at Pelican Bay. A guard was ambushed during a food delivery, pulled into a cell through the tray slot and beaten before others intervened. The prison went into chaos, alarms blaring, tear gas filling the block. The war over food had turned into war against the system itself. The aftermath of the guards' ambush was brutal. At Pelican Bay, collective punishment fell across the prison. No hot meals, no commissary, no privileges, only cold sandwiches 3 times a day. The less extreme quiet that followed was suffocating. Inmates sat in silence, chewing slowly, every bite a reminder of their loss. Guards marched with heavier boots, eyes sharper, hands always near weapons. But silence couldn't last. At ADX Florence, an inmate smuggled out a handwritten manifesto, a letter describing in detail how meals had been weaponized to torture inmates. The letter leaked to the press, sparking outrage. Officials denied it, but the damage was done. The extremes returned when Pelican Bay erupted once more. A coordinated protest saw dozens of inmates smashing their trays in unison, the sound echoing like gunshots through the halls. Guards stormed in, shields raised, the block descending into chaos once more. The war over meals had left scars on everyone, guards, inmates, even administrators. And the battle was far from over.